you so much, good friends, neighbors. I just feel so grateful that you are as affirming as I am of these fine 8 people that are in front of us. Thank you very, very much. And may I introduce them, in case you don't know their names, and be sure that you will get to know them by the end of today. Dorlene Agenbroad, starting from the right and going in that. Thank you. Wait, let me finish and then give her an applause. They are in alphabetical order, not in any order of when they went or how old they are or how long they've been. So first is Dorlene Agenbroad from Jamaica. Now applause. Then Marcia, am I yelling? Marcia Almquist from Bolivia. All right. Seth Armstrong, Venezuela. Michael Eulenberg, Turkey. John and Carolyn. Hitter.
Jim.
It is Jim. Jim. It's John Pound back there who's recording. Jim. And they, Carolyn, are from Sierra Leone, Micronesia, and Kazakhstan. All right. And because he and Carolyn went more places, stayed longer, and have kept in touch with the Peace Corps, he is not going to be one of the main speakers tonight. He is going to be the main speaker in our second Peace Corps program in 2 weeks on August 1st. Same time, same place. Okay. But he can answer some questions maybe that some of the other corpsmen who were serving long ago cannot answer, so he was willing to come with us. Beside Jim is Roger Reed, Nigeria. Alice Meleney from the Philippines, and Bill Roach from Iran. Our format will be that they will each speak about 10 minutes, and except for Jim, except for Jim Hitter. And then we will have Fleet of Foot. Thea Pfeffer. Pfeffer, you want to raise your hand way back there? And Jean Durning, Fleet of Foot, over here. And they will answer questions until our term date. Thank you so much. I'm going to give just a little bit of information that you may already remember, because I think you were all born too, except for Risa. In 1961, when the young John F. Kennedy created the Peace Corps, I was thrilled, just thrilled. And a year later, Congress made it official, authorized it. It was an independent agency and program of the United States government at that time. And Roger, our lawyer, reminded me that it was not like the Army Corps or the Navy or the Coast Guard or anything else. It was not like the State Department. That was a revelation to me. Anyway, in 1961, the budget was $410.5 million. No comparison, but since then, 235,000 volunteers have served in 141 countries.
Thank you.
Thank you. At the beginning of the COVID epidemic, nearly 7,000 volunteers were sent home from 62 countries. And with that, I will stop and we will get to hear from these wonderful people, starting with Dorlene Agenbroad from her Jamaica.
All right.
Good evening. Thank you for the pleasure of speaking with you. I did not want to go to Peace Corps. I wanted to stay playing the pipe organ and teaching the piano students that I had. I was married to Lee Agenbroad, and he always wanted to be somewhere else. I must tell you of some of the remarkable people in Jamaica. The first one was the lady with whom we stayed a night or two or three until we could get a house. I believe her name was Mrs. Young. I went with her one day to the bank right away to open an account, and she was across the lobby from me a little bit of a ways, and I saw her point to my feet and laugh out loud. I was wearing tennis shoes, and she didn't think that was dressed up enough to go to the bank in Jamaica. There was an occasion a few days later when I was standing by myself against a brick wall. My husband was a few feet away from me when a man wearing no shirt, a leather vest, and cutoffs approached me with not a threatening but a pleasant smile. And he said, "I'm concerned about you. You look so vulnerable." And I said, "Oh, my husband is nearby." Contrast that with a few days later, when I had been asked by the lady with whom we were temporarily staying to talk with her son's business office. He was involved in taking money, probably quite too much, from people and offering them passage into the United States, and then he pocketed the money. And so she gave me a phone number for his office, and he wasn't there. So I, in my naivete, said, "Would you please take a message from him? His mother says, 'Don't come home, the police are waiting for you.'" I probably made more mistakes, but I want you to know that it was such a pleasure, after adjusting to the fact that we were going to go where I didn't want to go, to begin to work into the community and teach teachers of preschool children. And one of the things we did was illustrate a funny little book about a donkey with long ears. And I was teaching them near the end of the class the hokey pokey. And we were having such a good time until we got to the verse that says, "You put your backside in," and they quit singing. And one of them very bravely tiptoed up and whispered in this ear, "Mrs. A, we don't say backside." John Searchwell was the principal at the high school and remains until he passed away a couple of years ago, a very dear friend. He was the first Jamaican to run an outstanding race and win. He also was the first Jamaican to have a Fulbright scholarship to England for a year. And it was there that he met his beautiful wife, Margaret. And one day, many years later, he called to ask if he could come over and talk with me. Sat down and he said, "Dorlene, there were people, you know, who thought our marriage would not survive. He from Jamaica, she from England. But he said it lasted until yesterday when she died." Tender memories from meeting people in Jamaica. And I'm very glad for the opportunity that I had to live there, to serve there, and to tell you about it. Right. Thank you.
Thank you.
My story is a little bit different. I can still remember Kennedy announcing that he wanted to form the Peace Corps, and from that moment on I said, I want to do that. And so my husband, Bob, always claims that I proposed to him because I said, I want to go into the Peace Corps, won't you come with me? And of course that meant that you needed to be married because that you couldn't get assigned to the same place and not be married. So we decided that we were both in college at the time, right? And we decided that we wanted to get a master's degree first, get all of that behind our belt, and then go into the Peace Corps. So we left in 1966 from New York City to go because we were assigned to Bolivia. And we were assigned to a rural education program. So in 1964, Bolivia had had their big revolution, and they had granted land reform to everyone, and then also created a rural education system to help the rural areas that were sparsely populated and had no education at all. So we trained in Logan, Utah, and which was an experience because it was a very Mormon place and we couldn't even get coffee to drink in the dorms. I was like, whoa. But Peace Corps, in its wisdom, decided that to have two people trying to do the same thing in a little tiny town didn't make a lot of sense. So they encouraged us to diversify. And Bob decided that he would stay in education and I would try something else because I was fluent in Spanish already. So I trained in home ec, which those of you who know me know that that's a pretty funny thing for me to be working in home ec. I don't like to cook, I don't like to sew, I don't like to do any of those things, but nonetheless, that's where I was. Training was excellent, rigorous, I have to say. I think the in-country training, the country training here was excellent, and then we went to Puerto Rico for 4 weeks for theoretically something that approximated what the country would be like that we were going to. So we were off to Bolivia, and a funny airport story. When we landed in Bolivia, some of you may know and may have gone to La Paz. The airport is at 13,000 feet. And when the doors to the airplane opened, the oxygen mask came tumbling down. We did not spend a lot of time in La Paz, but were immediately sent to Santa Cruz, which was, I'm going to show you on the map, which I hope you can see. Santa Cruz is this part of Bolivia. It's, as opposed to the 13,000 feet in the highlands, it's very, very low. It's very, very hot. It's right on the border with Brazil. It's near jungle, but not dense jungle. And another airport story, when you land in Santa Cruz, the plane has to buzz over the airfield in order to scare the cows off and then come back and land. So Santa Cruz was totally without infrastructure. They had no paved streets, no sidewalks, no sewer system. It rained all of the time. It was muddy. It was awful. We thought, oh yeah, what are we going to do here? But fortunately, we were put on a bus and went 10 hours up into the foothills of the Andes. And so now we were in Valle Grande, which is a lovely old Spanish town with cobblestone streets and a very nice climate. And this was where the district offices were that we were supposed to work in. However, this was not where we were going to work or live. We went on 6 kilometers later, more, on bicycles and foot to the town of Guadalupe, which is a town of 600 people, where we were to live. And the reason why we were assigned to this metropolis is that they had grades 1 through 6 of the rural school system. And so, and dependent on that nuclear school were 40 small 1 or 2 year old classrooms that had been built in neighboring communities with teachers who had been political appointees. Many of them could hardly read or write themselves. So it was how exactly we were supposed to work on teacher training was a little beyond me at that point, but I learned. In the meantime, Bob had, on the bus ride up to Valle Grande, had met a representative of Gulf Oil. And Gulf Oil said to them, to my husband, you know, just bring us a project. We'd be happy to help you with whatever you want to do. So this is, of course, interesting to us because we had no idea what we were getting into. What we had heard in training was that we needed to be flexible, to do what the community really wanted to do, to not go with our agenda, but be open to go. So this, you know, source of funds and do whatever the community wants to do sounds good. Well, the community wanted to build an irrigation dam. No small feat. But, you know, I mean, if you're 21 years old, you think, sure, we can do that. But we started with a feasibility study, and of course there's no topographer, no equipment, no anything like that. But Bob's first assignment was to measure all of the different plots of land, and the farmers had little plots of land scattered all over the town, all over the region. And so, but we of course didn't have those wonderful tape measures that you have now. And certainly nothing that you could push a button and read how far it was to the post. He bought a 50-meter piece of rope and tied a knot every 5 meters and measured with these farmers. He would go out to all of their little plots of land and measure out their funny shaped plots and then try to calculate what the area was so that we could turn this information into to the Gulf Oil people. Well, the result was that there was so much silt in the water that would come in the river that whatever dam was built would fill up immediately, and it wasn't feasible. Thank heavens, so that he reprogrammed himself after that. But I should stop and say that time, it was an important time for us in being accepted by the community because he really built trust and relationships with all of the farmers. If they will take you to see all of their pieces of land, which they don't want to admit beforehand because they don't want to be taxed on them, of course. So they don't want the government to know, but they trusted enough to take us everywhere to measure out these pieces of land. And that was a really significant step for us. The next thing that happened to Bob is that some politician came into town and said, "We are offering you a junior high school if you can build it." The town people said, "Of course we can build it. We have Peace Corps volunteers. We can build it." So that became the project. And in fact, 18 months later, there was a wonderful school, 4-room schoolhouse built with some modern architectural designs that we had introduced, because including windows. The schools there didn't have windows. But a fun side note to that is that so I'm full of side notes, I'm sorry. Cupertino, California had sent a notice to the Peace Corps office that they were interested in helping on a project. So, the school district. And so they decided that they would raise money for the roof tiles on this school by having each kid bring in a penny for each year. So, you know, if you're 9 years old, you bring in 9 pennies and whatever, but they raised enough money by that system to buy all of the roof tiles for this new school that was being built. And one of the wonderful results of that is that we then established a pen pal system with the kids from, and of course I was doing a lot of translating, but there were also kids in Cupertino who could speak Spanish, or teachers who could speak Spanish. And so that pen pal exchange lasted for about 4 years. And in it, I think that's one of the things that Kennedy had in mind, that sort of these kinds of contacts between people in this country and people in other countries could really enrich the lives of everybody, and I think that that was true. So my experiences in home ec were not great. But I ended up working with the teachers a lot, because since Bob was off doing something else, I said, okay, well that means I can work with the teachers. And I really had a good time. We did quite a few teacher training workshops, either in Bahia Grande, where different schools would come to learn about different things, different ways of presenting information, because of course they had no pencils, they had no paper, they had no books, so it's all rote memorization. What can you do? You have to, in order, the concept of having experiments and hands-on things to do was like really unheard of. I remember thinking one of my great ideas was to do a topographical map of Bolivia, because it has such interesting topography. So we did a paper mache topographical map, and the kids all worked on it, and we painted it, and we identified the volcanoes and all of this kind of stuff. It was a great experiment, great project, I thought, until the pig ate the map. You have no idea what you're going to run into. We did try to raise rabbits, we got from Heifer Project, and many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Heifer. We got 2 bunnies. We went crazy trying to find enough food to feed them, so let alone have enough food to distribute these rabbits to members of the community. I don't know, I think we gave that up pretty quickly. I think there are lots of errors that we made and lots of mistakes. We laughed an awful lot. One of my very delightful memories is that we had stopped in Mexico to see my family on our way down, and we bought a huge suitcase full of Spanish children's books. And so in our home, because we actually had 2 kerosene lanterns, we always had about 25 kids in our home every night. And they would come and read books and play games and do puzzles and whatnot. And So at 8:30 we would send them home, we would fall into bed exhausted. But those, I want you to know that those books were so treasured by those kids that at the end of 2 years they were still in excellent condition, and we rattled them all off, and the kids got to keep them. That was fun. Let's see, let me just review my notes here. One of the most interesting things that happened while we were there, is that Che Guevara landed in Bolivia. First he landed in the high country in the mines, but found that that was not a good place for him to operate. So he ended up about 40 kilometers from where we were. And I think that was not a good decision, either of his or Fidel's. I don't know who made the decision, because our part of Bolivia was a part where they had always owned their own land. So it didn't make a lot of sense to talk to them about overthrowing the landlords and owners, big property owners. And there was also an extremely Catholic part of the country. And as far as the people in Bolivia were concerned, he was an atheist, and he was not to be trusted. And so it was so interesting. We knew exactly where he was all of the time, though our government did not. Because the telegraph operator would send messages saying, you know, he's paid so much outrageous money for our chicken and for eggs and all of this, so we knew exactly where he was all of the time. And when he actually was killed, it happened like 20 kilometers from where we were. We saw the Green Berets. They would come to knock on our door and ask us to find clothing that the Green Berets could wear, because they were huge and the Bolivians are tiny. They could disguise them. They were always curious about what we knew. We always said, I don't know, because we were worried that we were going to be pulled from our town. I'm kind of surprised that we weren't. But we found out when we were leaving Bolivia, we asked, how come we were never pulled? And they said, we always thought he was going the other way. So I went, oh, okay. We did go to see his cadaver when he was lying in the morgue in Valle Grande. And it was an interesting historic moment for me, but also kind of sort of saying he was misdirected and ended up in a place which made him such a martyr because of that. So it was interesting to see how our government responded to that whole thing, how they acted throughout the whole thing from our perspective. I'm sure they had a different perspective, but nonetheless, it was a very interesting part of our time. Our time in Bolivia came to an end, and we came back to live in Seattle, where my husband was originally from. But partly because I have a Latin connection, and partly because of our time in Bolivia, the connections with Latin America have been important always, and continue. One of the things Mary Margaret had asked us to address was, how has it impacted your life? And first it impacted our life in that we decided to adopt a child from Mexico. Mexico because it was my country, because we saw so much of what happened in those countries, and we thought we could maybe make a difference in the life of one. Who knows? As I think you heard in the presentation from Estela, that we sponsored a family from Chile of 5 when the revolution overthrew Salvador Allende. Not the revolution, the intrusion of our government overthrew Salvador Allende. And people were refugees here. That was a family of 5 that has long maintained a connection to us. Then I got involved in taking members of Plymouth Church to Nicaragua. Some of you are here. I've taken 12 delegations of people from Seattle as representatives of Plymouth Church to Nicaragua, and that has been a very fulfilling experience up until things started changing in Nicaragua, and we all know what's going on there and how that's kind of taken a turn. I was also involved with Guatemalan weavers and brought many of their woven products, sold them many times at Christmas time here at Horizon House. I'm sure many of you maybe have some woven products that you've purchased from me in support of the weavers in Nicaragua. And then lastly, I worked for Casa Latina in the development of their day worker center when they were trying to buy the land at Chubby and Tubby, and they were kicked out because they couldn't, they were not acceptable. I can still remember the Mount Baker Community Club meeting where they said, the city is dumping their garbage on us. And so we moved from Chubby and Chubby on Rainier Avenue, and developed a wonderful site on Jackson Street. But that's so sort of working for the Latinos in this country and in the world has always been a part of me.
I'm Seth Armstrong. I was in Venezuela from 1966 to 1968, and it was an interesting time with a relatively conservative government, very different from the government there now. We had trained at San Francisco State in the city where I was born, and we were 3 months training there. In Venezuela, I worked with Mayor Antonio Ramon Zambrano and the city attorney Alfredo Gonzalez.
Can't hear you.
I'm just going to pick it up and go wrong, that's all right. I'm still Seth Armstrong. In Venezuela, I worked with Mayor Antonio Ramon Zambrano, the city attorney Alfredo Gonzalez, and delightful Secretary Consuelo de Paulini, who was entertaining throughout. Mayor's assistant, David Chacon, once asked if I'd been in the CIA. CIA. I had not been. So I told him so. This is a small town of San Juan de Colón, which is about 200 miles southwest of Caracas, across the mountains. The town was just about smuggling distance from south of Colombia. I didn't meet any smugglers. I didn't do any smuggling, but I did very occasionally go across to Cucuta, take an airplane out to Bogota, where I enjoyed the bookstores and bought Spanish books, and met a friend that I had there. Want me to start off? The nearest city where I lived was San Cristobal, down in the southwest corner of Venezuela. I proposed to have a modern city-style budget using their numbers and a new accounting format for them. The city accepted the budget form, but long-term accountant maintained her dated accounting system after that within 3 weeks of my departure. Lived in a room at the home of Doña Mari, grandmother with her 2 granddaughters from their parents' home, which was in Maracaibo, California. A year later, I lived in my own rented home and brought in Mariana and a young daughter as renters. The city council office was on the Plaza Central in the center of town. A small river flowed half a mile away along a large green meadow down a very steep hill. I would bus occasionally to Bogota and bought Spanish books there by Miguel Angel.
Can't hear you. Very close.
Keep the mic close to your mouth, Seth.
I will do that. promise not to start over. I would bus into Bogota. I'd buy Spanish books there and read them by the authors Miguel Angel Asturias, Paulo Coelho, Carlos Ruiz, Luis Zafón, Arturo Pérez Reverte, Mario Vargas Llosa, and read them at night after the girls had gone to bed. They'd go to sleep at 7 growing up in the country, but I was accustomed to city life and I'd stay up reading until 11 in Spanish, and it was a magnificent education by authors. I still have a bookcase that long in my home of their books. I would eat at Angelo's bar. He was a cab driver there. And, everything except the vegetables, which were washed in local water, so I didn't eat that. Had only a brief bout of Giardia in 2 years, which was not bad. And had a great time drinking cafe au lait with Latino friends in San Juan. We had occasional trips during that time to meet with other volunteers from our same group in Caracas, and that was a pleasure to meet them and see them. This was a group of professional people, doctors, lawyers, economists and such. We were supposed to be professional information to the people of Venezuela, and we did, which is what led me into budgeting and accounting. Thank you.
I'm Michael Eulenberg, and I spent 2 years in Turkey, Eastern Turkey. Eastern Turkey. If you've been to Turkey as a tourist and have not been to Eastern Turkey, you have been in a different Turkey than the Turkey I was in. Let me give you some context. I want to talk about the political climate in the United States in the 60s, which I'm sure you're all aware of. My wife-to-be and I we were both in school in Chicago. We took a trip to a Ban the Bomb peace march in Washington in February 1960. We heard Norman Thomas speak. How about a blast from the past, Norman Thomas? The Vietnam War was just kicking off in the early 60s, and it had a profound effect on everybody I knew, and me included. When the death of JFK was announced, I was teaching school in 4th grade, which is what I did after I graduated. And I went home that night and I asked what turned out to be my wife from the Ban the Bomb trip whether we should join the Peace Corps to honor him, and we decided we would when the time was appropriate. The draft started in full bore, and every male started scurrying, trying to figure out how to avoid the draft legally. Well, at that time, I decided to go to grad school in clinical psychology, and I was there for 2 years. And I found out later that it was what was called a healing art, and therefore was exempt. But I didn't know it at the time, so I still suffered the anxiety of waiting for the draft. I had my physical. I was drafted, but then I wrote the draft board a letter and said I was in the healing arts program. And I never heard from them again. They just changed the rating of my little card. So it was good that I was bold enough to complain. Also, a friend of ours who graduated the year before, who was a poet, was drafted, went to some camp somewhere in the South, and after 2 weeks was dead of spinal meningitis. And we found that such a tragedy, such a terrible thing, that I vowed never to go under any circumstances except illegally. But as it turns out, I was the healing arts guy, so I didn't have to be drafted. So by the time we applied to the Peace Corps, I was already 26 and not eligible for the draft anymore. We asked for a place that was not Spanish speaking, that we wanted to finish both of our graduate studies till June, and a place that was not too hot. We immediately were enrolled in a program in South America where it was Spanish and hot, of course, and started in March right away. There's your government for you. Okay, so we wrote back and said no, and so we got assigned to Turkey. Well, neither of us had any idea where Turkey was. So we looked up the encyclopedia and saw where it was on the map, but it didn't tell us a damn thing about what Turkey was or where it was. We then went to Texas for a 3-month training program where we learned Turkish, where we learned culture, religion, and history about Turkey, and how to teach English as a second language. So we were to be English teachers. As you've heard already, people did many different things in the Peace Corps, but we were to be English teachers. And they taught us Turkish using the methods we were to use teaching English as a foreign language, which I thought was fairly clever. We got to the training program, and one boy, and I'll say boy because we were all young and stupid at the time, was drafted right out of training. Another, after a year in the program, was drafted out of the teaching part, so the draft was still chasing us, raising my anxiety even though I didn't have to worry about it. So we taught English, and the schools that we were assigned to, although there were many different assignments, was a thing called a college, which is sort of like a college, only it was 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12th grades, and before that a prep year where the kids who didn't speak English were given 25 hours a week of English, as well as a couple other studies. I would say that many of the students actually became fluent after 1 year, because we had a program where we really leaned on them to learn English. It was hard, it was tough on us, and it was tough on them, but we actually accomplished that. I liked most of the students, and like any teacher, there were a few I disliked, but my favorite student was one of the kids who actually couldn't learn the English and failed his first year. He was so nice. He was from a rural village right next to a place on the border with Russia. He was way up there on the northeast. And he tried so hard, but he was one of those people who couldn't master it. And it turns out that there are two kinds of English students. One that can learn English accent-free, and the other barely able to. And I found that to be true as an adult. If you want to speak without an accent, you have to be one of the people who is able to do that. I think it's inborn. Just my own opinion. Well, there were many Turkish teachers who were supposed to teach all their courses in English, because it was a school that was just to learn English and get your courses in English. And my favorite was a chemistry teacher who hardly spoke English, and on one wall they were covered with these green wooden blackboards, green boards, and he just started at the upper left and wrote his lecture in little handwriting all the way across to the other wall. Then he walked back and wrote the second line. He really didn't speak English too well. So in the second year, it just so happened that one of the people who came in as a volunteer was a chemistry and biology major, so he taught the chemistry and science courses. It's very funny. I'm sure much to the relief of the guy who... Unbelievable, unbelievable. Now, I want to say something about the culture in Turkey. Turkey is an extremely conservative place, and we were in eastern Turkey, which is even more conservative than the rest of Turkey. A lot of women completely covered in black with the cloth held in their teeth. You could only just see their eyes. Not the majority, but many. One day the girls came to school dressed in white socks instead of their tights, and they were all sent home by the principal for violating the rules of decorum. All of them, all the girls were just sent home. So, I mean, they had agreed, obviously, to all wear socks. It was so hot, it was so humid. It was really unpleasant, but that was the way it was. Because we taught a lot of people English, I was really pleased. And I don't know if any of you knew Rashat Kasaba, who was head of the Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington for several years. He learned his English from Peace Corps volunteers in Turkey. Well, I want to go to the what I'll call the fallout of my years in the Peace Corps. My health. I got dysentery, not any kind of anything that they could trace to any organic reason. I was down to 143 pounds. So just for comparison, I now weigh 215, and I've lost 4 inches in height over the years due to osteoporosis. So I was a tall, skinny stick. My suit just hung off my body. So that made it very difficult. In Turkey, all the students assumed we were spies. That was their basic assumption. Some of us even asked what we did as spies in Turkey. Hard to explain in a village with, well, a village, 100,000 people village, with a couple of paved streets, no sidewalks. I mean, what's to spy on? We also had 20 miles away what was called a NATO base, which was really a US Air Force base. And later I found out that it was a spy headquarters spying on Russia. And I even, well, never mind. I did meet a spy many years later who had actually worked at another base further north. So it turns out that there were civilian spies who were working there, but we weren't part of that. The other thing was, there was a base in Adana, which is on the southern border right next to Syria. And most of the soldiers at that time were from the south. And some of the officers had their wives with them. And the wives went out as tourists in halter tops, short shorts. They got no culture studies whatsoever. In a country that's deep in Muslim thinking and feeling. And some of them came up to my city, which was Diyarbakir, up further north in the middle of the country. And we came to the conclusion that we were there as a buffer, 6 Peace Corps volunteers trying to heal the cultural mess of 20,000 Army and Air Force soldiers. A little bit cynical, but that's how we felt. Well, because I lost so much weight and was so ill all the time, all I had to do was leave Turkey on a vacation, and I healed up. So it was psychological, I'm sure. I disliked my Peace Corps experience. Later, which is 2 weeks ago, I found out that my ex-wife wanted to leave after the first year. This is 2 weeks ago. And didn't tell me. Because she didn't want to spoil my experience. I don't know if she'd have told me I would have agreed and left, but that's just the way it is. However, I told you about Rashat Kasaba, that's a win. I have lifelong friends who were in the Peace Corps, not in my site, but in other places in Turkey. About 6 or 8 people who we still keep in contact ever since then. One of my closest friends was in there with me, and he lives in Seattle too. Well, I learned to like yogurt, which I couldn't stand before I went there, and now I eat it every day. I have 3 different kinds of yogurt in my refrigerator. I learned to like mint tea, which I drink every day. I never drank tea, and certainly not mint tea. Only I just buy mint leaves from the co-op by the pound and make tea out of mint leaves, so there's not even any caffeine in it. And the skill I value the most, but I'll never use again, I can roast a turkey in a stovetop oven, which is just a tin thing with a hole in the bottom for the gas flame. And that's a story for another time. A person arrived at our doorstep with a turkey, and so while my wife was sleeping, I roasted the turkey.
Roger Lead, Nigeria. I applied to the Peace Corps in the summer of '62, and I began training in September. And we finished and we were sent to Nigeria. Our training group had about 50 people in it. And arrived in just after the beginning of the '63, and I was assigned to a secondary school and as a teacher, and left after the summer term, I guess you'd call it, in 1964. Actually, I cheated a little bit. I got out a couple of months early so I could matriculate at University of Michigan Law School and not miss an extra year. So the Peace Corps had been founded approximately a year, or announced approximately a year before I joined up. But by the time I joined, I was in Nigeria 6 training group. So we had already, 5 was a co-training group with us, but there had been 4 previous training groups already just for Nigeria, and Nigeria was not the first country. And when I applied, I didn't know where I was going to go, and it could have been Iran, it could have been Ethiopia, it could have been Afghanistan, it could have been Venezuela, or Latin America in many different locations. And the Peace Corps was an amazing, never to be duplicated organization. If you think about it, it's hard to believe it is the U.S. government. In that, in less than a year, this organization was formed, organized itself, hired staff, and got programs going in countries across the whole world, and didn't, in any sense, I think, fall short of what the president had announced when he formulated Peace Corps. And I'd like to emphasize that Peace Corps is a unique government agency for several reasons. First, it's independent. It is not part of the State Department or any other foreign policy apparatus of the U.S. government, or the CIA, by the way. And it is headed by a director who reports to the president, not to anybody else, and not to Jim Jordan either. It is an organization that recruits, trains, deploys, and supports what I will call non-government employees, i.e. Peace Corps volunteers. Now, those volunteers are paid and supported using U.S. congressional appropriations. But I do not consider them, and I didn't consider myself to be, and none of the people I was deployed with considered themselves to be U.S. government employees
at the direction of the government or enlisted in advancing foreign policy or any particular political point of view that the U.S. government might have at a given time. So that brings me to what is a Peace Corps volunteer. And a Peace Corps volunteer is probably best compared to a volunteer for an NGO or maybe a religious organization, in that they're not officially associated with a government program, at least in concept. That was built into the notion of the Peace Corps. What is at the core of the Peace Corps, and the Peace Corps has a mission statement that really hasn't changed anything, changed since it was formed, as far as I know. It says that its job is to promote international peace and to basically help other nations get to know us and help us get to know them. And that's pretty, that's part of what the Peace Corps amounts to. But the Peace Corps volunteer is somebody devoted to service. And I think back on all the people that I served with, and you listen to the people here, and this service did not begin and end with their Peace Corps volunteer years. They made it part of their life mission to serve in a whole range of capacities because it was important to them, and it was not that somebody told them, you've got to go out and put a good face on America because people don't think we're as good as we like to think we are. All right, so now that we know what the Peace Corps is and the volunteers are, why did I join? And I can't claim that I was overwhelmingly persuaded that I needed to go out and save the world. It was a challenge. It was probably an adventure. It was going to teach me things or give me an opportunity to learn things that I would never have had any exposure to otherwise. But there were some things that it was not. It was not a travel opportunity, at least not for me. It was not a career move, because I didn't stay with what I did in the Peace Corps. But I didn't intend to do that either. So I got pretty much what I was interested in when I joined up out of my service. And I made a lot of lifelong friends that I'm still in touch with who are other volunteers, and I must say that many of my Nigerian friends I have not been able to stay in touch with for obvious reasons. They're there and I'm here, and we've all had different life paths. But I do stay in touch with some to the extent I can. All right. Where is Nigeria? Africa is a kind of a weird-shaped continent. Well, most of them are, aren't they? Africa, if you start at the Straits of Gibraltar, start to bulge out to the west. And it bulges a long way. And this bulge is enormous. And that's what we call West Africa. It is a geographic phenomenon that is separated by the Sahara Desert from North Africa, and it really has no relationship whatsoever to East Africa, and very little to Africa starts to taper suddenly after this bulge tucks in at the Bight of Benin. And the Bight of Benin is about where Nigeria is located. And all the West African countries, most of which were either French or British colonies, and it includes, well, you recognize names like the Gold Coast, and this is not a country, well, it is, the Ivory Coast, Côte d'Ivoire, were ports at the mouths of rivers running from the mountainous spine of West Africa down to the sea. But the major river in West Africa is the Niger River, or Niger if you're French West Africa. And Africa has a number of great rivers on both sides of the continent, but the other great one on the west side, of course, is the Congo. But the Nile, the Niger is the heart of Nigeria, and Nigeria is the largest country in West Africa, and it has roughly two areas, the north and what we call the south. Think of the south as heavily forested jungle, or at least heavily forested, lots of rainfall, and the north as trending to the arid with plains, and the two different zones support entirely different forms of agriculture and subsistence, and different peoples with different languages and different cultures. I began training. We trained at Columbia Teachers College, and we were given a background in African history and so on, and various African politics, and how to not catch bad diseases if you go overseas, all that sort of thing. And we were trained in a local language called Hausa, which happens to be the lingua franca in northern Nigeria. At the time, the Peace Corps evidently decided we were all going there. The northern Nigeria is the most populous area and the largest, so that was somewhat plausible, but it turned out that probably most of us went to southern Nigeria, which consisted of two regions, east and west, and the dividing line being the Niger River. And I went to the east part of the country, so I'm getting here into the location I specifically wound up at. I was on a tributary of the Niger, a very large one, wide enough so that ocean-going ships, small ones, could come and anchor off our little town. And we were about 20 to 30 miles from the nearest mainland and the nearest main city. This was a village of about 5,000 people, and it did not have any paved roads, it did not have electricity, it did not have running water or a sewer system or anything like that, of course, but neither did most of Nigeria. When I arrived, I had been assigned to a grammar school, Meleney Grammar School, which was a newly formed, it was less than a year old, Anglican boys boarding school. The government was paying most of the freight, the Nigerian government, but they were trying to implement as close to universal secondary education as they could, so they sought out various agencies, and including religious, to sponsor schools and put them together. So this school was about 1.5 miles out of this little town, on what amounted to a footpath. It was called a road because there were quite a few feet that used to traverse it, including ours, to get out to school and back. The school was cinder block with a wooden platform floor to keep you out of the bugs and the snakes as much as possible. We had windows but shutters, no glass. And of course, no running water, no electricity, tin roof. So there was some classroom buildings that had been hastily erected, sort of a mess hall that had open sided, that was open sided and had a tin roof that the boys had, and then some school teachers' quarters for the masters who were all male, and not a too bad principal's house located around a campus that was basically just a green, well, an open space. No facilities to speak of except classrooms, desks, chairs, and blackboards. No labs, no equipment, no library. But we taught to a test. The British system involved a uniform syllabus, which at that time was used throughout English or British West Africa. And you either passed that test after ours was a secondary school, so after 4 years, equivalent to our 12th grade, you took the test and you either passed or failed. And if you failed, you didn't get a certificate of graduation. And so the boys knew exactly what they had to do. And we had just textbooks that were designed around this curriculum, with a little lesson, some questions, and on to the next chapter. I taught English, history, chemistry, physics, French. I've forgotten probably a couple of other things, all of which were in the syllabus. I was not allowed to teach upper form English because the headmaster, who was the only other college graduate, and of course was Nigerian and a member of that community, did not consider me qualified to handle English in its true, genuine variety. When we had our textbook English chapters were excerpts or compendiums of everything you can think of from your own background, I'm sure, plays, but excerpts from Shakespeare, poems, various excerpts from literature. So we didn't have a library and we didn't really need one. You could pass the test using the textbook, which was a good thing because that's all we had. We had no lights, so the boys studied at night in their dormitories, which were organized around the British system with prefects. The prefect system means that the senior boys actually run school, or run the dormitories anyway. And then the teachers are called masters. And there would be a master associated with each of our houses. And we had, I forget whether it was 4 or 6, but I had a house that I was supposedly a master of. But I didn't go over there and do a bed check or anything at night. The prefects attended to that. If somebody was out of line in a serious way, the prefect might come and get me and I was supposed to do something about it. But otherwise. Now the town was a really interesting one. Let me tell you what some of the family names were of the prominent families. Dom Pedro, Bob Manuel, Jack, and George. So what does that tell you? The Portuguese started to explore the coast of Africa and trade as early as the 15th and perhaps the 14th century. And then along a couple centuries later came the English. These people were middlemen in the trade between the Europeans and the hinterlands of Nigeria for hundreds of years. They did not particularly, they didn't lift an eyebrow when a white person showed up from the USA. There have been a fair number of white traders and certainly white government officials who had been in this, stationed in this town. But by the time I got there, they were all gone because, well, there had been a change of government, and they all had to go someplace that was more desirable to the government in power. But the point is that people were very used to Europeans, and then they were also sophisticated in ways that most people in Nigeria were, of course, not. So it was a unique situation. It was an opportunity to, kind of become this member of the staff. When you joined the Peace Corps, you took a vow of poverty. Not quite as bad as the monastery, but the Peace Corps allowed you to live with the local population and not above it. So you got a compensation structure for your job, which supposedly was equivalent to your counterpart, in-country counterpart. So I got something like 50 or 55 Nigerian pounds a month, which was, I figured out once, something like $87, and that's what I had to live on. I was very isolated in this situation. I really didn't have much of a social life because I only got out of town once to go to the Port Harcourt, and to get there the town didn't have any motor vehicles. I had to get in a dugout canoe with an outboard motor and travel an hour and a half or so. And then go to the Bank of Nigeria, and cash the check for my 53 pounds, so I could live the next month. I don't have time for anecdotes or anything, except just one. The adventure part of my whole Christmas break of my first year, I got together with some training group people who were in northern Nigeria, and we did an expedition literally to not unexplored, but a very remote area on the Cameroon border, which was a great learning opportunity, and which you can read about in the book in the library.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'll have to save all the anecdotes for a later time.
She'll get to it next.
Two more speakers.
Yeah. We knew that this was a possibility. We talked it over, not in person, but in correspondence, and I said, I don't want to cut you off because you're talking about out of your passion, but are you willing, if we run out of enough time, to extend into the second. And Alice and Bill have said that they will, and Jim has said he will share with them. In addition, there are several other people who have either spouses or children or somebody else who's been a part of it. And I have these two wonderful runners, Jean and Thea, who are just so eager to run around and ask questions. But I can tell we're all just awed, and we've had enough for tonight. So thank you, Dorlene. Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Seth. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Roger. Thank you, Olivia. And thank you, Bill. And thank